I'm very excited to have three outstanding reporters and editors to talk about financial coverage, the budget process coverage, how to make stories that deal with federal process issues come alive. And we're going to hear from each of the three of them, and then we will have plenty of time for questions. I'm excited to have Damian Paletta. He's the economics editor of the Washington Post and co-author of the recent New York Times #1 bestseller, Nightmare Scenario, about the White House's response to the coronavirus pandemic. Before becoming an editor, he covered the White House economic policy for the Post. We had him as a speaker a couple of years ago, and he was very insightful and inspirational. And one of the fellows one of the Paul Miller fellows who was sitting in the audience and was inspired by him was Caitlin Emma, who is our next guest. She covers the federal budget and spending fights on Capitol Hill for Politico. She's co-author of a daily afternoon newsletter for Politico Pro called Budget and Appropriations Brief, and she was a Paul Miller Fellow last year. So welcome back, Caitlin, to the Paul Miller family. All of you current Paul Millers, I'll be reaching out to you next year, the following year to get you on to talk about your particular beats. And our third speaker will be Renee Merle. She's an editor at the Washington Post. For nearly 20 years, she worked as a business reporter and editor covering defense contractors, the collapse of the housing market, and how Wall Street's power was wielded against consumers. She's now a features editor, but I wanted to bring her along because I've always admired her work over the years in bringing stories alive and having stories that illustrate how it's affecting real people out there. So it's a little after 4. We are on the schedule for this until 5, but we'll hear from the three of them, and then we will have time for questions. So Damian, I'll turn to you first.
Great, thanks. Hi, everybody. It's really great to see you. I wanted to start with a little bit of my backstory. I grew up in St. Louis, went to Boston College, then I got my master's degree in journalism from the University of Missouri. And when I was at Mizzou, I applied to probably 30 internships, that summer, and I only got one offer, and it was at the Cape Cod Times on the business desk. And the reason that was the only thing available is because no one had applied for that beat. I had no experience in business or economics, but it was literally the only thing available for me at the time. So I agreed to do it, went out there, lived on the Cape. And I think it didn't take long for me to learn that when you write about economics, you can literally write about whatever you want. Everything has an economic angle. And, the richest people, the poorest people, every single person who intersects with society has an economic story to tell. And so, it was when I realized that, and I realized there was a lot of job opportunities in this space because people were kind of inherently, turned off by covering budgets or economics. I thought it was just about numbers and going back to high school math or something. There was just a lot more openings and opportunity here. So I, continued in this space. I guess that was 20 years ago, and now I'm the economics editor at the Post. I think what I've always tried to do, not having had a background in economics before, is find a way to connect the bigger stories to economics. So, and as Caitlin and Renee will tell you, there's so much in Washington that has to do with money that affects every single issue. So, today in the news, there's, obviously big debates about immigration. There's a huge budget and economic angle. There's debates about Afghanistan, obviously a lot of questions about foreign aid, foreign policy, and stuff like that. So I think, whereas some people might find that, economic or budget stories kind of pigeonholes you into, the back pages of the paper or parts of your company's website that people won't read, that's really not the case at all. There's always an opportunity as a budget or economics reporter to thrust yourself into the front of the story, because there's always a financial element, and because a lot of other reporters just won't be drawn to it. So I just think it's such a great zone to live in. It's a great kind of zone to put your career in, because there's never a shortage of things to write about. And I just wanted to give one example. So last year in January, we were all following President Trump's big trade showdown with China. And, obviously that's an economic story. Trade is something that gets covered even less than the budget, but it was a big story because of the tariffs that the president was threatening to slap on China. So, we wrote a big story in the days leading up to and the day of this big historic trade deal with the Chinese vice premier. Now, if you look, it says January 15th is when the story, when the agreement was made and that story ran. That January 15th was the time when they were starting to shut down Wuhan, China, city of 11 million people. So, the president is kind of holding back criticism of China in the middle of this crisis in China because he wants to get this trade deal done that he thinks is going to lead to a strong reelection opportunity for him. If you fast forward a month, this crisis with the coronavirus is gaining momentum, and whereas the president had been really reticent to really crack down and speak aggressively, and even to try to warn people about what was happening, there was a point when the stock market just crashed, when people feared that this virus was going to really move through the world in a way that couldn't be stopped. And so there you go. There we have this healthcare story, this pandemic, this virus, and it becomes this incredible economic story because, like you see there, the stock market completely craters. Then following that, there's massive layoffs. There's a point when I think we're laying off 1 million people a day in this country, which is just astonishing. And then, obviously this, the crisis went on, but just really a month after this. So in mid-February, we have the highest stock market of all time. 6 weeks later, at the end of March, they pass a $2 trillion, essentially economic rescue bill that sends checks to people. It gives unemployment benefits to people. So we went from having what we thought was one of the strongest economies ever to, we were on the verge of kind of like another Great Depression. And so, a lot of the basic reporting that we do every day, talking to lawmakers, understanding how the budget works, understanding the kind of nitty gritty of the economy, that prepared us for events like this, where, we're not just on the front page once a day, we're writing, 4 or 5 stories a day from my team to try to chronicle what's happening, because there's just so much interest from readers and so much confusion about what this means for them. It's one thing for people to wear masks and try to protect their families and even hunker down when they had to, but understanding what this meant for their bank accounts and for their jobs and for their families, I think is something that we really needed to help them get through. So I just wanted to kind of give you that sales pitch. I mean, I promise you, I've been in this space for 20 years. I never ever would have envisioned when I went into journalism school that I would be an economics editor. It was just not something that I thought I could, add much value to. But I mean, I'm as in love with it now as I ever was, and I'm like a big advocate for it, and I know that Renee and Caitlin are as well.
Okay, let me ask one question, and then we'll move on to Caitlin.
Yeah.
Your team, I guess a couple of questions. What kinds of reporters are on your team, and are you national desk or business desk, or kind of you crossover?
Yeah, we're on the business desk. My team actually has at the moment has 12 different reporters. We have a reporter who covers the White House, economics, congressional economics. We have a reporter who covers the Fed, who covers trade, labor, the food industry, the business of food, and we have someone who specializes in graphics and charts, who tries to really make these stories visual. So we have a team, we want to get out there and cover the whole economy. So, for example, we have a reporter who's based in Los Angeles who has written about kind of climate change and those effects on the economy. So, we try to get out. The economics team that I am part of is part of the broader business desk, which also includes like technology reporters and things like that. We often work kind of hand in hand with the national desk and those White House reporters and Congress reporters too. But I think being on the business desk and the economics team gives us a little bit more free reign to just get up and get after a story rather than working as part of a kind of a bigger unit like that.
Okay, I didn't know. So Laura Riley is one of your reporters?
Yep. Yes, she is.
Okay,
Yeah.
she's a former fellow and former recent speaker for us.
Excellent.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's go to Caitlin.
Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me. As Chris said, I'm calling from the Capitol building, so I'm not in like some weird cave or I don't like have a podcast or whatever. I'm just like in a soundproof call booth. But I'm a budget and appropriations reporter for Politico. I've been doing it since really before, I think a lot of folks probably remember the government shutdown that started at the end of 2018. It was the longest shutdown ever. I started like a week before that. So it's been a pretty crazy ride for the last couple of years. And to be honest, like Damien was saying about how, he's really passionate about economics coverage and he never thought like that's what he would be interested in doing. When I was like approached with this job, I'd been covering education policy at Politico, actually with Ben Werman. We were both on the education team and I was sort of looking for a change. And my editor was like, would you be interested in covering, budget and appropes? And I thought it sounded so boring. And I was just, my first gut reaction was like, no, not at all. But then the more I thought about it, the more I was like, maybe I should do this. I guess it'll get me, into Congress, covering Congress. And it's just ended up being the most like wild of rides, the most interesting beat. When you sort of step back and look at the federal budget process, like, it begins with like the president's budget proposal, and then, you can go sort of step by step. There's supposed to be a budget resolution, which kicks off the writing of annual spending bills. And, it's supposed to be this cyclical thing that never goes according to plan. And, you end up in these crazy scenarios like we are now. We're 10 days away from a possible government shutdown. Congress has to act to raise or suspend the debt ceiling by next month, maybe the middle of November, or the Treasury Department runs out of money, which has never officially happened before. And it would be a huge, huge deal that would, throw financial markets into chaos and endanger the government's credit rating. And Democrats right now are trying to pair a bill to keep the government open with action to take care of the debt ceiling. And Republicans are saying that they are not going to help on that. So we're just the budget process itself has sort of brought us to this crazy fiscal cliff. And this just keeps happening, year after year, because Congress is just really terrible with deadlines. And these big budget deadlines just promote such crazy political brinksmanship that, it's just been one crisis after another. So I don't know how we get out of this. It's been a really crazy afternoon, but that's just all to say that like covering the federal budget process might sound super boring, but it ends up yielding just an incredible amount of action on so many different fronts. And it's just been a lot of unexpected fun. And I have no plans to want to change off of that. But I made some notes here just for folks who are maybe interested in sort of getting acclimated with this beat. If you want to sort of start to understand a little bit more about what I'm talking about, I'd first plug groups like, not to lean too heavily on like think tanks, because every sort of think tank has its sort of agenda in what they're doing, but like the groups like the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities and the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, they have really helpful primers on just what the federal budget process entails. Appropriations like 101, everybody's talking about, budget reconciliation. They have really good primers on like what is budget reconciliation, like why is everybody talking about that? And when I was getting my start on this beat, I mean, I was like really like basics. Like I really didn't know anything. I'd been covering education policy for 5 years. So I was like literally reading, you know, what are annual spending bills and what do they entail. So I'd really recommend like just brushing up on groups like that and reading some of the content that they have on the process. Congressional Research Service is also an awesome resource for any question that you guys might have on like what the heck people are talking about. Like, you know, you've been hearing a lot about the bird rule. And obviously there's big news last night where the Senate parliamentarian, who's this woman, essentially she's in the arbiter of like the Senate's rules. She said that, you know, Democrats can't pursue immigration reform through this big reconciliation social spending package that they want to pass, you know, to approve all these priorities without Republican support. The Senate parliamentarian said, you know, you can't do that because it doesn't gel with certain rules. And you hear a lot about this bird rule in conjunction with like reconciliation. And the Congressional Research Service is like such a great resource. If you just go to their website, you can type in like any term, and, you know, these people at CRS will, you know, break down every single issue for you in the nitty gritty. CRS also maintains like an updated table that tracks House and Senate progress on the passage of annual spending bills. So the way it should work, the way the annual appropriations process should work is that it should be, you know, pegged to the fiscal year. So the reason why we're looking at a government shutdown in 10 days is because fiscal 2021 ends at midnight on September 30th, and the new fiscal year begins on October 1st. So in a perfect world, the budget process worked exactly like how it's supposed to. You would have a slate of 12 annual spending bills that cover all of federal discretionary spending. So we're not talking about mandatory spending here on things like, you know, Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security. We're talking about like thinking about like federal agencies and how they're funded. So in an ideal world, by the end of the fiscal year, Congress will have passed all 12 of these bills to fund the government into the next fiscal year. That like never happens. So you'll hear like Congress routinely relying on something called a continuing resolution. There's a number of different ways that you can refer to it, like a stopgap spending bill or a short-term spending bill. You know, basically this kind of spending measure just staves off a shutdown while Congress is like, you know, working behind the scenes to actually craft like regular spending bills. The reason why we're looking at a shutdown right now is because we're not even kind of close to passing those 12 bills, and it's, you know, 10 days away from the end of the fiscal year. Another example in why Congress is really bad at meeting deadlines. But CRS, like, you know, if you're interested in like the bill that funds the Justice Department and you're like, I don't know what's up with that, you know, CRS sort of will keep tabs on where exactly that spending bill is. Has it passed the House? Has it passed the Senate? Like what's been proposed so far? What did the president propose? You know, how did Congress meet that? So all of that, CRS is just a great nonpartisan source of like just a plethora of budget issues to rely on. And then a couple other must follows are obviously the Congressional Budget Office, which also sounds like it kind of is a boring agency, but this is really a must follow for different things like cost estimates on legislation, which can be a huge deal for you know, the chances of success and how, you know, lawmakers are going to vote for it. CBO does a lot of cost estimates for legislation. They periodically release budget and economic projections, both short and long term, and those get like a lot of play in the news whenever they're released, because like CBO will say something like, you know, we project the federal debt to be whatever in 10 years if Congress doesn't do anything. And then, you know, you can cue all the like concern from members of Congress who say that they're really worried about federal spending getting out of control and what are we doing about it. And then, you know, you have the other side of like that rhetoric where it's like, the federal debt doesn't matter and this isn't something that we should be worried about. So CBO plays a really big role in how legislation gets passed and all of that. So sort of paying attention to what they're putting out is very helpful. And the only other thing I would note is that the Government Accountability Office, this is a little weedy, but sometimes they'll wade in on issues about how federal money is spent. And often this can be critical of like how the current administration has been handling federal money. Sort of they operate as like a watchdog of sorts on these issues. And one story I would just highlight from that in sort of an unexpected way that this beat ended up taking me was a couple years ago. A colleague of mine and I got a tip about the Trump administration freezing money, military aid to Ukraine, and it was kind of unusual, and we didn't really know what it meant, and we ended up looking into it, and we were able to break the news that this money was on hold. And long story short, it sort of started off this like series of events that led to President Trump's first impeachment, because Congress began looking into why is the Trump administration holding up this money, and are they holding it as a matter of leverage to get Ukraine to investigate the president's political rival at the time, which was President Joe Biden. So GAO ended up weighing in on that issue, and they said like the Trump administration was breaking the law by freezing that money, and that was one instance in which GAO really made huge news that was like very consequential when it came to the president's impeachment. But that's also another example of how like, you can spend this beat covering Congress and all the craziness here, or you can spend this beat monitoring how an administration is dealing with congressionally appropriated money. And there's so many good stories to mine from that too, but I don't want to go on too much longer. So yeah, I guess I'll just leave it at that.
Let me ask one question before we go on to Renee. Talk a little bit about how you cover the budget process and how that might differ from what a reporter at the Post, how they might cover it, and how a reporter who works for in the Washington Bureau for a regional paper, how they might cover it. I mean, are you really into the weeds more so than others are, or give us your approach for it?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think it's really dependent on, like you said, where you work. So I work for Politico, but I also work for Politico Pro, which is our paywalled policy subscriber news service. So for like Politico Pro, we do, my colleague Jen Schultes and I, who's also spoken to the fellows before, we do a paywalled newsletter every single afternoon. And that gets more weedy. Like Politico Pro will do a lot more like legislative sort of breakdown stuff, more fine-grained coverage of like appropriations bills and what's in them and stuff like that. But obviously for Politico.com, there's more sort of concern with like the big picture. And a lot of that has been focused on Congress for the last year. I felt like during the Trump administration, I was covering a lot more of the Office of Management and Budget, which is a key agency that is basically charged with, figuring out how congressionally appropriated money is spent, because the Trump administration was often doing a lot of like wonky, sometimes like illegal things with money. But for the most part, this beat has been pretty focused on Congress, what leadership is thinking. Like Democrats are obviously in control. Politico is really concerned with sort of getting at like political strategy there, what that means for federal funding, what that means for sort of like the politics and the caucus dynamics and a lot of that stuff. And I think like, if you worked at perhaps like a different paper like the Post or the Times, like there's more opportunity there to sort of show how like the federal budget and federal spending connects to real human beings because it does. And I think often that gets lost in Politico's coverage because we're so like solely focused on Congress and like what they're doing. But federal funding trickles down to regular people, and it's really important to highlight that. And I think as a regional reporter, that's something you could also spend a lot of time in as well.
Okay, well, thanks much. We'll come back to more questions later on, but let's now go to Renee. So Renee, I want to thank you for coming, and she's going to talk a little bit about how to make that connection in stories, policy stories, and the effect they have on people. So Renee, I'll turn it over to you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I wanted to start with a little bit of background because Damien reminded me of a story about how I came to this field. I'm from Texas, and my very first internship was at the Austin American-Statesman. And I was supposed to be an intern on the city desk, and I was very excited. And I was just going to be a city hall reporter and a political reporter, and I was determined to do that. My first day of my internship, the city desk editor was busy and shifted me off to the business desk. And the business desk editor could tell that I was completely devastated and said to me, you know, the thing is, every story is about money. And you can make any story about money and make any story work in the business desk. And I've been a business reporter ever since. I spent 20 years on the business desk at the Post. Before that, I worked at the Wall Street Journal, and have always just spent a lot of time over the last couple of decades working on making sure that people understand that a lot of the stories that influence their everyday lives have a background in money, and that a lot of it's influenced by money. So, when I approach stories now and thinking of, and trying to make that connection to real people, I often ask myself, why does this matter? Why should people really be concerned that this regulation, this budget measure has been passed? And sometimes it's just an accountability question, especially when I was covering defense contractors and we were spending billions of dollars on things that didn't work. And then as I moved into covering other areas like housing or Wall Street, it became still an accountability question, but also that these policies and these decisions were making a difference in the average person's life. So, sometimes explaining these things can be pretty simple, I think, when it's about a stimulus check or about whether we should get vaccine booster shots. Explaining regulations in those ways, you're always going to get attention. But a lot of really important decisions are made by regulators, and they get very little attention. There's just one line in a budget. And if nobody explains it to you, or really takes the time to dig deep and find out why this was done, people will look over it and not understand why their lives are changing. So more than a decade ago, when we had that last financial crisis, I covered the collapse of the housing market. And the Obama administration then passed lots of bills to address these issues. The big banks said a lot of great things about what they were doing for real people. And my job was to look at what was actually happening to real people. So I spent a lot of time talking to people about what kind of help they were getting from the banks and from the administration, and kind of bridging the gap between what we were being told about what the policy did and what was actually happening. That's come up again during this current crisis that we're in. Before I switched to editing, I was writing a lot about what was then the coming eviction crisis. And I wrote one story about that mentioned a courtroom in Austin. At the time, there was a eviction moratorium, national, that was supposed to protect millions of people from evictions. But I took a look, I actually sat through some of these eviction court hearings and saw that the law wasn't being enforced in the way that regulators, that Congress had told us it was going to be. And in one case, the judge just didn't understand the law and didn't understand why somebody would be protected by this eviction moratorium. And so I had to, and when I called that judge afterwards, it took me like a week to get her on the phone. And I explained to her, asked her like why she had, evicted somebody that was actually protected by the moratorium. She said, oh, well, she misspoke. But her, obviously she actually just didn't understand the law, and her misspeaking affected a real person. And finding those kinds of examples of where what we are being told is a policy or the law differs from what's actually happening in the ground, I think is just an important part of what we all do. During this crisis, again, before I went back into editing, one of the things I did that actually I was surprised that it got the most attention, the most readers, were just simple FAQs that explained laws to people. Just explaining to people what protection you might have if you're a renter or a homeowner. I would I would do it for 1 month, and then I would hear from readers, well, what about what's going to happen next month? And I would hear a lot from individual homeowners or renters with their specific concerns, which helped me also find stories that I needed to be writing. Another example of, as I was thinking about this presentation, another thing I wanted to bring out is that sometimes it's like just a little line in a regulation or a law. I was writing for a while there a lot about consumer debt. Actually, before the crisis, we were at our consumer debt levels were at historic highs. And there was this one line in a piece of regulation that said on the face of it that once you had a credit card bill or something that had been in default for a certain number of years, it was dead, that the company, the bank couldn't come after you for it. But as I was digging into it, I realized there was a loophole in this thing called zombie debt, where the debt collectors could actually trick you into reviving debt that was already dead. It was, again, just a small piece of a big piece of legislation that impacts a lot of real people. The reaction that I got from people who didn't realize that they had been confused and basically tricked into paying debts they didn't have to, it was pretty astounding. So, I would say that, in terms of finding these types of stories and finding the examples, it's actually gotten so much easier with social media, like looking on Twitter, LinkedIn, Reddit rooms. There are so many places to look for people. In terms of finding story targets, the people that that Caitlin talks to and that Damien's reporters talk to are some of my best sources. There is so much expertise on Capitol Hill that if you develop good relationships with those staffers, they can help you find the stories that the real people stories that you're wanting to find. In some cases, because lawmakers are hearing from those people individually, but also because the people that staff these committees are really, in a lot of cases, experts in what they do and that they understand the law. So it's not that I would necessarily be quoting those people, but by being in communication with them and talking to them, I might be able to identify the story that's not being told, or identify the part of a story that still hasn't been explored in its fullest. So I'll stop there.
Okay, well, thank you very much. So we have time for questions from the fellows. I want to ask one question of all three of you, and that's, it sounds like each of the three of you ended up in, business and budget and finance reporting. It wasn't how you set out. So I'm curious, how good are you with numbers? And are you surprised that you are now doing stories and editing stories that are focused on numbers?
So if there were 7 Paul Miller Fellows last week and there's 12 this week, what percent increase is that? I still would need to take like 15 minutes to figure that out. I did really well on my math SAT and actually bombed my English SAT, but I think the numbers themselves, as long as you kind of are honest with yourself about your strengths and weaknesses and you can take time and go through stuff, it's not an impediment. I think what's more important, as Renee was saying, it's like an intellectual curiosity. And, for example, some of the best economic stories are about one number, one thing that's happened. Caitlin's story that led to the impeachment was about one budget line item. It wasn't about 72,000 different things. It was about one thing. And so, I would just try to reinforce that, some of these economics numbers or stories might not even be about a number. It's about a trend or a progression or a development. So, obviously, I think being afraid of math might be a drawback, but if you're, you got a calculator and you're not afraid to kind of run the numbers and ask someone to double check your numbers on a certain story. And as Caitlin also said, if you know smart people to call in a pinch from the CBO or some think tank, then you can get through almost anything. But more important, anybody can do numbers. I think it's the intellectual curiosity and, just kind of that zeal that we all had as young journalists about a heck of a story that'll take you, far on this beat for sure.
Okay, Renee, how about you?
I would totally agree with that. I think the stories that have the most numbers sometimes are the most boring, in part because the writer hasn't taken the time to actually step back and explain what they're telling you, or hasn't taken the time to kind of figure out why these numbers matter. I certainly wasn't some kind of math genius. I ended up I have an MBA from Columbia through the Knight Badgett program. And I can even tell you from getting my MBA as somebody who's not a quant, that is completely doable. If you can ask smart questions, you can make it, anywhere. And if you're just interested in breaking these things down, then you'll be fine. I don't think that you need being a math genius is not. I don't think that would be at the top of anybody's list. It's more about just asking the right questions.
Okay, and how about you, Caitlin?
Yeah, I would say 100%. I think, the most math that I really do probably on the job is mostly you should probably learn how to calculate a percent increase or a percent decrease to say Biden wanted this much and House Democrats are proposing this much over what he proposed. And other than that, you're really just looking at top line funding levels or budget line items or something like that. But it's really not, it's not so much about the numbers or math or anything. And I sucked at math. I was not good at it. I don't enjoy numbers outside of my job. I don't like Sudoku. I took a class in college called problem solving, and it was just to fulfill a gen ed requirement. And it was about Sudoku and problems that were Jane sitting next to what's his face with a blue shirt, and you know what I mean. And I got a C minus. I'm not good at it, but you don't need to know math to be good at it.
Okay. I suspected that those would be your answers, which is why I asked the question, because I'd be ashamed to share with you my grades in college econ. Well, I guess I will share them to you. First time I got an F. The second time I got a D minus, which was that D minus allowed me to graduate the next day. And within 5 years, I was a business and finance reporter, which is something I did for quite a while. But yeah, it's just asking the questions and not. I'm actually fairly good at math. I just was not a good math or econ student at all. Well, so fellows, any of you have a question? Well, Damien, I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about, you've been kind of watching the budget process for these last 20 years. How has it changed? Caitlin was describing kind of how kind of dysfunctional it is right now. It's been that way for a long time. Has it been that way the entire time that you've kind of been paying attention?
Yeah, it actually has been. And it's too bad because it means that, sorry, my dog's trying to join the conversation. They're supposed to pass a spending package once a year that covers the period from October 1st through the following September, which is the fiscal year. And because what ends up happening is what's happening now, they don't get around to it and everyone has to wait to the last minute. They do these partial bills called continuing resolutions that, in this case, it might go from, October 1st to December 22nd or something like that. And then maybe another couple weeks or a couple months. And to be honest, it takes up a lot of Caitlin and my time to track this, tomfoolery, because obviously the consequences of a shutdown during a pandemic are immense. And so we have to cover it because it's important to our readers and to keeping government honest in how it operates. But, we can just spend a lot of time with them kind of inching the football down the field as opposed to writing about some of the more comprehensive, structural, and consequential things. So, but to answer your question, yes, it's pretty much been broken with maybe one or two, times that they did it right. It's pretty much been broken for at least since the Clinton administration.
Okay. We'll go to Orion here in a second, but first of all, what's the dog's name?
Cookie.
Cookie. All right.
Yeah.
Orion?
I hope you'll forgive me asking kind of a general question. I'm the DC correspondent for the Spokesman Review in Spokane. And so one of the few folks here in the Paul Miller group that are, regional reporters don't really have the chance to focus on any one thing. And I'm not particularly strong on, budget business stuff, but I wonder if you have some, any or all of you guys have advice on how to sort of find that number, that interesting thing that sticks out, that is maybe especially relevant for a certain part of the country. So far, I think, my experience with the budget, for instance, is sort of just it's important background to have, but I don't know that I've really found, gotten good stories out of it. So I'm curious what you guys, what kind of advice you have for us.
Yeah, I would say, Caitlin, correct me if I'm wrong, I would say you want to be all over Senator Cantwell and Boeing and the money that they get for trade assistance. And it's a big issue for them is, both on the budget, but also understanding the trade assistance that they're supposed to get from the Export-Import Bank and maybe the assistance they don't get. I know there's Caitlin, there's something that she was holding up. Maybe it had to do with assistance to Airbus. I don't know. There was something that she was, maybe it was even an Amazon angle. There was something that she was really adamant about that was changing the budget process or impacting some of these spending bills.
Is that the Blue Origin thing?
Maybe it's Blue Origin.
Yeah, I think so. What you're saying sounds vaguely familiar. I would just say I was kind of a regional reporter a long time ago. I worked in Connecticut and I worked for a couple different places out of the Connecticut State House. And I would just recommend, like Damien said, your senators, your congressional delegation, I would get to know their offices. I would get to know their staff. I would start asking, what do you want? What do you need? What do those lawmakers want to deliver on for back home? And probably a number of state agencies, if you have resources there, would be able to tell you sort of what they need, especially during the pandemic. You can look at any number of things. Renee was talking about rental assistance, how federal rental assistance is playing out in your state, how, what are the disaster aid needs in your state? There's just so many different federal buckets of money. And a lot of them aren't functioning well, or there are many needs that are unfulfilled. And I think there's just a lot of different story opportunities that lie in those avenues.
Yeah, I got another question for Damien. It's kind of on budget themes, kind of not, but just tell us about your book that came out this summer, and tell us about the connection to budget themes, and then just give us a story about how that came about, and
sure,
how you juggled day job with book job and that kind of thing.
You have to ask Renee. Could probably give you a different version of it because she was working with us and saw me melting down. But I became the economics editor in let's see, September 2019, And I had been an economics reporter for many years and thought it was kind of a natural progression. Sure enough, several months later, the pandemic hits. And I was an editor, but I was editing one of our health reporters' stories, Yasmin Abu Talib. And Yasmin was writing a lot about this, the emerging pandemic and kind of if you remember, one of the big issues initially was the travel ban, banning flights out of China and then banning flights out of Europe. And so there was obviously economic implications of that. So I was editing some of Yasmin's stories on that. And Yasmin was approached by a literary agent based on a couple of her stories that were kind of inside the White House. And they had asked her to write a book about this whole thing. And then she approached me and said, well, what if we, because we don't have backgrounds in politics, which is your typical kind of White House book is going to be someone with more of a political background. But she said, what if we do a story about this tension between the health and economic teams inside the White House and how that led to a lot of the mistakes and, knee-jerk decisions and stuff. And I had actually been to the altar on a book before. I had written a proposal about something I wrote years ago at the Wall Street Journal on Social Security disability. And I had this proposal in my head and wrote it out for an agent, and it ended up bombing spectacularly and no one was interested in it. So I kind of had my heart broken, and I told Yasmin, this process is terrible. It's never going to work. And she said, well, the agent says people will like it. Let's just spend a weekend and write a proposal. And so we did, we wrote a book proposal. It was like 15, 20 pages and turned it in. And sure enough, there was a lot of people interested. I think what obviously benefited from having, it was all anyone was talking about at the time was COVID. And so we sold the book to HarperCollins. And, I mean, it was, I have 2 young kids. It was, I was working around the clock as an economics editor, and then on nights and weekends I was trying to do interviews for the book. It was important. We really committed to it. We believed in the book, but it was really tough. We both went on book leave from January 1st through the end of March, so we took 3 months off to finish the book up, and I'm really proud of it. The book did really well. It was the hardest thing I've ever done professionally. It was funny, as we started writing, I don't know how much you guys even care about this, but as we started writing, I remember asking our editor, Jonathan J. was the same person who edited Hillbilly Elegy by J.D. Vance and had done some big books before. And I remember, first we wrote the first 80 pages and he said, this doesn't work. So imagine writing 80 pages and having to put it all in the shredder. And then I was thinking, am I supposed to do those things I learned about in high school English, like foreshadowing, I don't know, dream sequence or something? And he's like, no, just, write it. You can't write it like a newspaper article. You need to kind of slow the beat down a little bit, but write it, with your voice. And so Yasmin and I, we kind of had a Google Doc and just went through back and forth, and we ended up being great friends through the process and stuff. But it was, we thought at the time when we started the book in April that it would be about April through June. We thought this pandemic would kind of burn itself out. And then after George Floyd and the country kind of exploding in June and July, we realized that this was gonna, be a whole different book. So we had the book run all the way through the election and came out June 29th.
Okay. And did you, the 3 months of book leave, were you intensively writing at that point, or had you been writing all along?
We had been kind of writing, but we really kicked it into another gear. But I'll tell you that the book was due March 15th, and we had big interviews, late into March and into early April. So we were making changes to the book up until the final moment, because some people weren't comfortable talking to us until they were until Trump was out of office. And they didn't kind of fear any retribution or anything. So some people really weren't comfortable talking to us until really late in the process. And we would get big developments or scoops or news items that, we didn't want to shoehorn in the book. So we might have to rework a section a little bit. But we kind of went down to the wire for sure.
Okay, and one more question on the writing process. Did you handle chapters and she handle chapters, or did you work on them together? And how similar were your voices?
I think it depends. So there were some, for example, there's a couple sections. There's one whole chapter pretty much about Fauci, and it's chapter about Birx, and that's just way more in Yasmin's zone. So she would do most of the writing and reporting, although we did a lot of interviews together. And then I could kind of come in behind her in the Google Doc and have some ideas or stuff like that. And then there was other sections where I might have done the first draft and then she came in behind me. And then there were sections like the weekend Trump was sick, where we both had a lot of reporting and we kind of did it together. So I think we did our best to obviously there's two of us, but we did our best to kind of come up with a common voice, and our editor, I think, helped with that a lot, kind of smoothing things out. I hope it comes across that way when people read it.
Okay, well, it must. I have not read it yet, but I'm going to. I have it on order, so congratulations on.
Thank you
on the success of that. Damian, Renee, and Caitlin, I want to thank all three of you for coming to talk with us. Caitlin, welcome back to the Paul Miller family. This will be it for this month's program. We'll get a note out about next month's program, but it's scheduled for the 2 weeks from today, on Monday, October 4th. And with that, we'll draw today's to a close. I want to thank everybody. Have a good week.